Hi, everyone. Welcome to the NERPS webinar series on peace and sustainability in the context of global change. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dalia Simangan, Associate Professor at Hiroshima University, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. If you're not familiar with our organization, the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability at Hiroshima University serves as a global network and information hub for collaboration on research on the peace and sustainability nexus. And I want to take this opportunity to share with you that we will be going to have our second NERPS conference next year in Thailand from February 28 to March 3, 2023. And it's jointly organized with the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand. And you can submit your abstracts until October 30, 2022 by visiting www.nerps.org, where you can also find the other details about our network. And this is the 17th installment of the series. And the topic of today's webinar is positive peace and environmental sustainability, watershed conflict and collaboration in the Philippines. Before I introduce our guests, I'd just like to inform you all that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording through our website and social media accounts. And for our attendees, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box or in the Q&A anytime during the webinar. If you want to ask the question yourself, you can also use the raise hand function, and I will enable your microphone so that you can speak directly to our guests and ask your question. I'm sure the issues that we will be covering in this webinar are not unique to the Philippines. So please don't hesitate to share with us your thoughts and questions at any point during the webinar. Now, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce to you my colleagues, my collaborators, my friends, our special guests today, Dr. Francisco Magno and Dr. Srinjoy Bose. Our speaker, Dr. Magno, is a professor of political science and development studies at the De La Salle University, where he occupied different positions in the past, including director of the La Salle Institute of Governance, the director of the Social Development Research Center, and chair of the Political Science Department. He finished his PhD in political science from the University of Hawaii under an East-West Center Fellowship, and his BA and MA in political science from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. And our discussant, Dr. Srinjoy Bose, is a senior lecturer in politics and international relations and co-chair of the UNSW ECAN Executive Committee. His research has been funded by the European Union, the UN Development Program, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the United States Institute of Peace, Australian Aid, and Facebook. Thank you very much, Dr. Magno and Dr. Bose, for your time today. And Dr. Magno, you may now start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dalia, for that very generous introduction. I would like also to thank our discussant this morning, Srinjoy Bose, of course, for also supporting the research that we undertook in Lake Lanao. So I'm very happy to be part of this research collaboration. So I'm very happy to be working with younger colleagues who are very much in the thick of this scholarly discourse. So I would like to present our research findings from the study on watershed conflict and collaboration in the Philippines. I would also like to recognize at this time my research associate in the Philippines, Yasmira Moner, who is from the Mindanao State University, and also my younger colleague in our Department of Political Science and Development Studies, Topin Ruiz. I'm sure Yasmira can share some of his thoughts later on in the open forum. So this is a presentation on watershed conflict and collaboration in the Philippines, locating this particular case in the peace and sustainability nexus. So what I'll be doing in this presentation is to provide a broad examination of the peace and sustainability nexus in Lake Lanao, Philippines. Consider the climate-induced water scarcity and floods, as well as complex water governance systems that contribute to local and regional conflicts, and to identify the local sources of positive peace and environmental sustainability. In our paper, we consider the water situation in the Philippines. The Philippines, of course, is known as an archipelago with the three major island groups of Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. And so the locus of our study is the island of Mindanao. The Philippines is very rich in natural resources, which includes water, which is essential to the country's economic growth. It is a country that is very rich in river basins. In fact, there are 421 river basins. 18 of them are considered as major basins. However, there is a decline, as we have seen especially in the past several years, in per capita water allocation due to increasing population. Perhaps compared to Japan, which is an aging society, the Philippines is still considered a young society, still with we can call high population growth. Degradation of watersheds due to population growth and congestion is a contributing factor, aside from climate-induced changes in the problem of the water situation in the Philippines, such that 17 out of the 20 major river basins or river basins will have a water shortage by 2025, as argued in many studies, including that of Agnes Rolla and colleagues. Freshwater systems in the Philippines are in danger due to pollution and the rising cost of potable water. This is due to the continuous pollution of rivers that pass through or near urban centers. So this is the location of our case study, Lake Lanao, which is in the province of Lanao del Sur. It has a high elevation, and Lake Lanao is the largest lake in Mindanao and the second largest in the Philippines, next to Laguna de Bay or Laguna de Bay. So you can see here a map of Lanao del Sur, where you can see Lake Lanao. Lake Lanao is considered to be among the ancient lakes, and it is the most famous of all water bodies in the province and is part of the greater Lake Lanao-Agus River watershed. So it is part of a complex water ecosystem. Lake Lanao is home to several rivers, and the largest of them is the Agus River. Agus River is the only outlet of Lake Lanao, and it starts from Marawi City, flowing to Sagiaran, Lanao del Norte, and finally to Iligan City. So it is a source for hydroelectric power. Agus 1 River and Agus 2 River are the only hydropower plants of the Agus River hydroelectric power plant system within the boundaries of the province, and the rest are in Lanao del Norte and Iligan City. So this is a slide showing the water resources, and you have here a table of the different lakes that converge in Lake Lanao. Okay, so you see here that Lake Lanao has an area of 357 square kilometers and a volume of 22 cubic meters and a maximum depth of 112 meters. So let me now go to water governance as we understand water governance to refer to the political, economic, and administrative systems that develop and manage the resources of water. It is also responsible for the delivery of services to the different levels of society. Therefore, the water governance system is very important in the delivery of services, as well as in the operation of, as I mentioned, power plants and the delivery of water to the different sectors of society. So as we can see, there are various challenges in terms of this delivery system because there are competing uses of water in the area. So there are various laws that govern the distribution of water in Lake Lanao. As you can see, dating back to the time that presidential decrees were issued, way back during the time of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. As you know, we now have a new president, and he is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. As you can see, presidential decrees were issued during the time when it was still martial law, but until repeal, these are still existing. And then you have the newer legislation that came out after or anchored on the 1987 Philippine Constitution. So these are different laws that govern the different uses, and these are the legal frameworks on water governance. As you can see, there are various types of tenure, ownership, and rights to use the water resources. So given the complexity of these institutional arrangements, this is where you'll find a lot of competition and conflict. But of course, the challenge is how would this framework enable collaboration and finding peaceful, in a way, peaceful coexistence among the different users. Of course, later on, I'll discuss the passage of the Bangsamoro Organic Law that also incorporates another level of resource management. And in fact, this is something that we are still monitoring because the Bangsamoro Transition Authority is still fairly new, and it is still grappling with all the challenges in terms of policy development with respect to resource uses. So as you can see, the different laws that I presented or policies consider ownership, rights, and distinction between surface and ground water, property rights that serve as the basis for different permits, licenses, and the franchise for collection and distribution. So this include the private rights granted to individuals versus the collective water rights. So these also include the legalized intersectoral prioritization and basis for prioritization, and the linkages between land and surface water and between land and the forest environment. So considering the ecosystem of the entire area, as I mentioned, the regional context of governance, there's this is anchored on an intergovernmental accountability system on water uses. So that has to also interface with water planning and development, private sector and NGO participation. And when we speak of private sector, what are market solutions to water resource competition? We also have a decentralization law which empowers local government units to undertake environmental services, including managing community-based forestry projects, as well as the maintenance of an environmental and natural resources office within the local jurisdictions to monitor water and environmental quality in the area. So applied broadly to society, we consider the sociocultural utilization of the lake, including the following uses by the community. Water is used for drinking, fishing, bathing, washing clothes, household consumption, and ablution and rituals that are connected to community and local culture, and transportation. Lake Lanao through the Agus River supplies the 6 hydroelectric power plants of the National Power Corporation, generating electric power daily. Hence, the Lake Lanao Agus River Basin was proclaimed as a watershed forest area. So it is also a protected area under another law, which is the Integrated Protected Area law. Hydroelectric power generation requires the construction of dams, and this process obstructs the natural flow of water, which could lead to adverse effects on the environment and people. So nutrient loading and the introduction of invasive species have dramatically worsened the fish biodiversity within the Lake Lanao Agus River watershed. Positive peace, of course, can be defined in 2 ways: negative peace and positive peace. So we would like to explore and examine in this presentation the potentials for enhancing positive peace that we have seen to be developed through local cultural practices. So we will discuss that in the next few slides. So globally, positive peace increased by 2.4% in 2022. And among all the pillars of positive peace, the pillar on low levels of corruption deteriorated. And in the Philippine case, we did key informant interviews with experts on public accountability, and the Philippines experienced a decline in terms of upholding measures against corruption. So relating corruption and peace, corruption can lead to social unrest due to dissatisfaction in society relating to government performance and efficiency in addressing social problem. Reports coming from the United Nations Development Program, Commission on Audit, and the Office of the Ombudsman in the Philippines, rough estimates place the leakage from corruption within a span of 2 years to be approximately 1 trillion pesos. So the broad connection between corruption and environmental sustainability is that when there is corruption, the government is unable to effectively implement environmental rules, as shown in mining contracts and logging concessions. So I would just like to summarize the peace and environmental issues in Lake Lanao. There is the observation that corruption and weak governance are present in the area, in the different local government units. The presence of invasive species, reducing endemic species in the lake. So there is also the lack of compliance with solid waste management policies, as manifested by poor sanitation and garbage pollutants in many areas of the province, especially in the urban centers like Marawi City. So this is supported also by, when we speak of weak governance, also the lack of local legislation on solid waste management. We have a national law, but the national law encourages local government units to come up with strong plans or effective plans for local solid waste management. The rise of water levels due to climate change is very much observed over the past few years. And we also noted in our study how socio-cultural conflicts such as RIDO or revenge actions that are very much family-based and land conflicts congregating in and affecting peace and environmental issues in Lake Lanao. Species loss is observed, especially with the dropping of carp-like fingerlings, so that the tiny fishes like the local species, tumaginting, that are endemic to the lake have diminished. The species that have been introduced have been eating the smaller ones. Another factor that we got from the key informants attribute the reduction in fish species in the use of Lake Lanao water for energy generation. Among other things, the use of lake water or river water to produce electric power requires channeling water into the turbines, while the building of those dams brought in benefits, including cheap electricity and jobs for workers in industrial plants using the energy. There have been also negative effects as observing that the free-flowing waters, farms, and cemeteries and historic sites have been drowned by the storage reservoir of dams. With respect to fishes, their migration can be blocked, and thus their natural habitats that are essential to their survival can be changed, which are disadvantageous to endemic species. In terms of culture-based governance in Lake Lanao, in a Maranao society, it is the clan rather than the duly elected representatives who hold the nucleus of power. So this is very contextual. So even if you have this a formal institutional process of changing leaders through elections, you see the interface with the clan-based system of power. So it's an expression of social power. So we have to consider how the social structure of kinship could also be a source of social capital in strengthening people-oriented accountability measures. So if the clan system, or the term used is political dynasties, is a prominent feature that interface with tradition, with formal politics, it's also interesting to see how family-based types of or actions or practices can also, in a way, foster accountability. Mashiwara or community consultations are among the mechanisms in promoting transparent, participatory, and accountable governance. The local government is also working on e-government and digital strategies to provide real-time and accurate information when it is needed most. So this is very interesting. While we are talking about traditional family-based governance systems, then you also have the context of digitalization. So it's the interface between traditional and modern technology. Establishing a community participation fund is one of the ideas that is being considered as one of the sustainability mechanisms in promoting people's participation in governance. I'm going to the few slides remaining. So these are some of the developments uh, with the emergence of civil society movements, interfacing with community-based cultural practices. So we have the Lake Lanao movement, or the Sala movement, which is a civil society organization-led movement that was created in the 1990s, primarily to secure, protect, and lobby policies that would be environmentally friendly. This is a multi-stakeholder organization with strong women voices who are advocating for ecological stewardship to save Lake Lanao. So I think this is also a product of the uh, the local government code that encourages the participation of civil society organizations in local governance, including local environmental management. As we should emphasize that the local government code is also anchored on the 1987 Philippine Constitution, which emphasizes the participation of non-government organizations and people's organizations that we now collectively call civil society organizations in local governance. So we have the concept called participatory local governance. So another CSO initiative is the Casa Limbago movement, which is co-founded and convened by one of the environmental champions and human rights defenders of Lanao, Samira Gutuk. It has been active in lobbying for ecological solid waste management in the province and organic agriculture in the province in the Bangsamoro region for Muslim Mindanao. So it's very interesting to see these evolving engagements in the new region, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao, created from the Bangsamoro Organic Law that was passed in 2018. And the developments to watch there is the evolution of a parliamentary system of governance in the region. And it would be interesting to see how the civil society organizations engage in the governance and political processes in BARM. Let me end this presentation by reiterating again the indigenous and local community-based sources of positive peace and sustainability in Lake Lanao. I got a lot of advice here, and of course I mentioned the research support of my young colleague Yasmira Moner, and let me cite these observation that the Maranao people, which still adhere to the traditional norms and practices such as the Igma and the Taritib, which translates to consensus and order, underscore the importance of cleanliness as next to godliness, which is why, according to key informants of the study, there is a need to integrate local cultures in the basic education curriculum to revive the consciousness, to protect, conserve, and sustain environmental stewardship. So I think this is a very interesting statement because it is anchored on what's happening also in the region. In the Mindanao State University system, peace education is now a required subject. So I just would like to examine further how environmental sustainability is part of this curriculum. How is it part of this curriculum, the peace education? Although aside from what I've been talking about, the Mindanao State University, which is higher education, the incorporation in the basic education curriculum as part of civic education. In the Islamic faith, environmental stewardship is a moral obligation of every Muslim, and every Muslim is a Khalifa or protector of the environment. This faith-based practice of environmental peace building is noteworthy. So it would be very important to examine, as I mentioned, the civic education component of the education system, of how local cultures are incorporated and faith-based systems are integrated in civic education. Kapamagayonan or consensus building is a social practice of building consensus where the community exercises a deliberative process of decision-making, which is inherent among the Maranao people, handed down from generation to generation. As we can see, there are lots of youth-led initiatives in the region. For example, youth-led initiatives in ecotourism in the province that is culturally and environmentally responsive are some of the local practices promoting peace and sustainability in the lake communities and the Bangsamoro region. I understand that the Mindanao State University is undertaking efforts to really come up with a program that incorporates Lake Lanao in their civic education programs. So these are some photos of the research, and thank you very much for your attention. And we'll be prepared for the open forum later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Magno. This is indeed enlightening and, as a Filipino, quite encouraging, because maybe Srinjoy will talk a little bit more about this later. But we started this project looking at what can be improved in the Philippines, because the Philippines is ranking quite low in positive peace index, in the environmental performance index, and we're also one of the countries that is really high in the climate risk index. So, but then our motivation is really to look at all this more specific local dynamics and pathways that we can find in sites that are, experiencing environmental stress and as well as conflict risks. And it's really, really fascinating to know that just by looking at the site in Lake Lanao, we found this participatory local governance mechanisms, the deliberative decision-making processes, peace education that are all, inherent and already existing in this community. So, and I think one more thing that was striking for me is digitalization that you've mentioned, because we really didn't look at the access to information. Although it is one of the positive peace pillars, we didn't look at it at the beginning, but then when we really go to the local level, all these different factors come into play. So thank you very much, Dr. Magno, for your presentation. Now may I invite Dr. Bose for your comments and discussion.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Dalia. What an insightful case study. For your viewers, Dalia, as Dalia has already mentioned, this is a collaborative project that three of us and other people are working on. There's a number of different case studies that we're working on in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and it's encouraging to see both differences and obviously commonalities in understandings of local dimensions of governance and environmental engagement and awareness and responses, or the tensions and responses between state and local communities. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to get some of my thoughts together by way of drawing some connections in terms of what Francisco has already outlined, vis-a-vis some of these other case studies that we've been looking at, Nepal, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to focus on three different elements. And thereafter, I might identify some provocations or provocative questions where I'd like to probably see us discuss other important causal mechanisms or factors that are working that might help explain, in particular, the Philippine case study. I'll try to do that all in 10 minutes, but I'm sure in the Q&A section, many of your viewers will probably preempt me, so that will be good to see as well. My first comment is a departure point from Dalia's observations on the really the positive piece element of your case study, Francisco, and particularly that last slide where you problematized customary mechanisms of really governance and how that is understanding and responding to issues such as environmental stress, resource governance, and issues which are on the periphery of those, but are nonetheless related to water governance issues, such as conflict arising from water, dispute resolution mechanisms, and so on and so forth. And so on this first comment, I suppose, or on this first observation of customary and indigenous knowledge systems, my first observation, I suppose, is what are the tensions between state mechanisms, state interests, state ways of knowing, seeing, and feeling, in other words, state ontology and state epistemology, and how that is contrasted with more community-based knowledge systems, and particularly indigenous knowledge systems. So I'm wondering what the tensions are, because what we can see, whether it's the Philippines or whether it's another conflict-affected society, such as Nepal, or post-conflict societies such as Nepal or Afghanistan or any other, where there is intervention taking place. State-based intervention or international intervention, oftentimes a combination of the two, we see the imposition of neoliberal practices. Neoliberal practices which may not align and complement more community-based or customary practices, let alone indigenous practices, because they're the bottom feeders, right? Nobody pays attention to them, essentially. And I'm wondering how these tensions manifest in the Philippine case study around water governance in Lake Lanao, and what the corollaries are. Francisco, you spoke of one corollary. You spoke of how community knowledge is impacting education curriculum. This is so important because what they are trying to do is they're trying to inculcate and introduce customary and indigenous practices into that curriculum. And I'm immediately wondering how that sits with the state and the state's ideas or interventions in governance and education in particular, or international donors' understanding, the World Bank's understanding, or the UNDP's understanding of how to do curriculum reform, which is linked to the environment in such spaces. So I'm wondering if you could illuminate a little bit more about those tensions between and what the upshots are on education curriculum, dispute resolution mechanisms, and so on and so forth. What intervention, state intervention and international intervention suggests about what you identified as decentralization practices and devolution practices as far as water governance is concerned. So again, where indigenous and local communities sit on decentralized practices, but also in terms of how law is devolved to the community, and whether this complements, international interveners or state interventions understandings. So I'm guessing. So I suppose to summarize this first observation, I want to hear a little bit more And I want our audience to discuss it perhaps a little bit more about this tension between neoliberal practices of the state and of interveners and indigenous and local community knowledge systems. The second observation has, I suppose, specifically to do with your observations on corruption. And I think, again, this is an area that we find cuts across the other case studies that we've been looking at in our project as well. Corruption obviously is detrimental to these local communities, elite, oftentimes government corruption and elite-driven corruption. So elite capture, essentially, of state resources. And we see that this is detrimental to the local populations, but also it results in weak governance. So I'm wondering again, if you could tell us a little bit about the nature and the characteristics of corruption in the Lake Lanao region, when you're talking about agencies and organizations of government which are tasked with water governance, and whether you perhaps notice differences between regional corruption and more national corruption, or whether there are similarities, whether there is a patron-client relationship that you observe regionally or between center and periphery, and how that is then impacting community conversation and community engagement. It occurs to me that when we look at elite corruption, one really helpful way to look at elite corruption, and I'm presuming the Philippine case is similar because it is corruption that is elite capture, that we could possibly identify the networks of corrupt activity or networks of elites who are engaging in quote unquote a corrupt activity. But a further commentary, oftentimes going back to this discussion about neoliberal practices versus indigenous knowledge systems or local knowledge systems, oftentimes Western donors and intervention organizations perceive any and all patron-client relationships or exchange relationships as corrupt. Now, those practices might make sense in the locale. It might have local purchase. It might have legitimacy in the local area that we are studying. In other words, it may not make sense to the Western foreign intervener, but makes perfect sense within the workings of governance and state-society relations within the Lake Lanao region. So what may be alien and antithetical to governance in Western eyes and ears might have legitimacy in local context. So I'm wondering what the characteristics or nature of corruption is in this region, and whether local communities see them as a problem, or does it have elements of legitimacy, and how this might then impact water governance in the region. And there's an element over here that is related to this broader issue of conflict management and dispute resolution. From what you said of dispute resolution and conflict management in the Lake Lanao region, and I'm guessing broader Filipino region itself, is there are practices in place that are doing dispute resolution, but these practices may not make sense to Western ears and eyes. That they might view these practices as either illiberal, that means outside the scope of liberal philosophy and thinking, but also it suggests a lack of recognition of alternative development pathways and models. And I think if we are talking about the peace and sustainability nexus, which is our topic, and of positive peace, then our job should be to illuminate these alternative development models which have purchase in the local community, why they have purchase in the local community, and explain and demonstrate why they are offering and providing benefits. And immediately I can think of the Afghan experience in water management, where there is variation over here in terms of success and failure of local customary systems, but various parts of Afghanistan, which is a conflict/post-conflict state, have at the village level or the district level water governance bodies. Oftentimes a person appointed by the village council and the village chief or the district chief to ensure water governance, and part of their duties is to ensure dispute resolution mechanisms. In some districts and some provinces, it works like a charm, and in others it doesn't, so there is variation, and that makes perfect sense because it is a conflict country and we are experiencing different stresses throughout. So those are some observations in terms of differences, similarities, things that I'd like to hear a little bit more of. And I'll end by just asking you some questions, because I'm really genuinely interested in hearing more, because I think this is where the richness is coming from in your investigation. Perhaps if you could speak a little bit more about how you are conceptualizing decentralization and devolution, how you notice that and observe that in the Lake Lanao region. I'm wondering if you've seen variation in the Lake Lanao region with respect to water governance, specifically the distribution of water and the distribution of hydroelectricity. Whether there is, Lake Lanao is quite a big area, whether depending on which part of the province you are in, depending on which districts you're perhaps looking at, whether you see variation. Do some districts reap more benefits from water distribution and hydroelectric distribution to the detriment of other? And then the obvious question is why? Is it demography related? Again, maybe it's networks of power, networks of elites. Some elites have more power. Maybe they have more influence with the central government or the regional government, etc., etc. And are there basically tensions in the inequitable distribution of water and its benefits? Are there tensions in law and policy? And this goes back to my first observation on the neoliberal practices versus indigenous knowledge systems. Are there tensions between protection of indigenous peoples and interests versus modernization policies? I remember in one of the slides, you spoke of the different laws that have been introduced since the 70s all the way to the early 2000s. There was a law that ostensibly was articulated to protect indigenous rights, and a decade on, they introduced a modernization law. I am thinking, again, based on maybe some other case studies, there would be tensions therein. So how does that square? How is that tension reconciled? You spoke a little bit about e-governance versus customary governance, and you were talking about, quote unquote, the interface. And I'm wondering whether these laws provision opportunities to identify and then advance and champion those interfaces in terms of water governance. The final two questions that I will have for you, Kiko, is how is water planning in the Lake Lanao region affected by corruption and elite capture? And I really enjoyed your ideas about consensus building. And I'm not going to pronounce the Filipino word over here because I will butcher it. But what struck me were what you mentioned, the deliberative characteristics, but also hints of egalitarianism. And immediately I'm thinking about Nepal, because that's one of our other case studies, and Afghanistan, because that's another case study, as you know, and similarities, because various customary processes tend to be more deliberative and sometimes even egalitarian. And whether these egalitarian deliberative practices are lying in tension with more neoliberal policies of state or of interveners. And also in the Filipino case, whether it's lying in tension with Islamic principles. So for example, in Afghanistan, Sharia law tends to be a little bit more egalitarian than customary law, the Pashtunwali code. Wondering whether that's the opposite over here in the Filipino example or otherwise. I'll stop my observations there. I think I may have gone over 10 minutes. Apologies to both.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you, Srinjo. I was about to send you a message to please wrap up, but thank you. Very, very great observations. Perhaps I'd invite Dr. Magna to briefly respond to those observations and questions, because we also have some questions from our attendees.
Thank you, Srinjoy. A very powerful observations, and I don't think I can answer everything, but definitely your questions challenge us to surface a lot of the information that we gathered, because we gathered a lot of information, and I think our challenge right now is framing this information and data within the contextual and conceptual framing that you suggested. So I agree with your first observation that there are definitely tensions between local indigenous tenure versus the state-based, and all connected with the neoliberal concept of resource uses. So definitely the more traditional types of tenure, community-based, it's all about the household uses, ritual-based practices that are at risk given the large industrial uses, energy-related uses of water, and energy-related, and I think that that falls squarely between what you call the protection issue, which the community would support. Of course, it's also connected with livelihood issues that are very much dependent on water, traditional agriculture within the area, versus industrial development, industrial progress, supported by those who would like to use the energy from the lake, and because electricity is provided, of course, sometimes the farther you are from the area, the more electricity you have. So I think that's also the tension, and this is not, I think, exclusive to Lake Lanao. It's, as you mentioned, it's also seen in other countries, the egalitarian question. The ones providing or the ones who are the steward of water, meaning they live next to the lake, are the ones who do not have energy. And of course, we've seen that in other places, even in the northern part of the Philippines. There is, I think one of my students is here who studied the Angat River Basin, and Angat River provides water to Metro Manila. I think one of the tensions here in Lake Lanao is also the provision of water to the urban centers. So they, of course, when you speak of urban centers, and I think I would like to connect also with the local politics. Most of the local government executives actually live in the urban centers. So even if they have been elected as, let's say, a mayor in a municipality outside the city, they would still live, or they will have residence in the city. So I think that will relate to the equality of or egalitarian uses of water. But I think if we can present those data more vividly, perhaps even in a map of how networks of water and energy use are related to networks of political power. So I think you made a very powerful
Political
framing
power
there.
political power and political ecology. I mean, political ecology could be
Yes.
the framework.
So it's political power and energy, which we also call as power. Okay, maybe just very quickly because some maybe the participants would also like to speak. So I find it very fascinating to really explain more these consensus building mechanisms and how they interface. Community-based mechanisms interface with the formal mechanisms. For example, at the local level, you have elected village officials. We call this barangay. We have barangay captains who are elected, but then you have family-based elders, a community of elders. So how do they interface? Perhaps that's also similar to your cases in Nepal and Afghanistan. So we would like to describe this in a better way. Certainly, elite capture is very much there. Elite capture of state. I think what we need to do is to look at the levels of governance at national and the regional aspect. I think has become more important, especially within the context of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao. Considering that those who have been appointed to the Bangsamoro Transition Authority are not necessarily just the elite politicians. There are also professional or middle class families that are able to be appointed. But the challenge is that there would be elections in 3 years' time. So this is where we can see how or whether there would be continuity in the clan or the powerful clan, powerful political families. And maybe my final point is these new developments that I presented in the few slides or in the last portion of my presentation, the growth of a civil society movement within a Muslim cultural context. And you see women leaders are emerging. In fact, one of our key informants, also a good friend, Samira Gutok, ran for the national elections recently. And she continues to be a leader in the area. So you also have youth-oriented initiatives as part of this movement. That's why I think this connects with the digital initiatives. You have younger people also occupying government positions, but there's tension. You have the older traditional, since it's clan-based, you consult the elders, but then you have young people. And how does it converge in the emerging civic education curriculum? So these are currently under review. And what I mentioned in the Mindanao State University system, the requirement at the college level, as part of the general education curriculum, a peace education subject as part of the general education curriculum. But we would like to find out the content, whether environmental sustainability is a big part of this and how this is discussed. Perhaps more studies should be done, and I think these cases that we are discussing, including other countries, can perhaps be considered in the college curriculum later. So let me end at this point.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Sunjoy. And
Thank
I
you. Thank you,
appreciate that.
Dr. Magno, for the explanation. I mean, this makes me even more excited moving forward for our comparative case studies. But I hope it's okay to extend for just a couple of minutes to be able to answer some of the questions from our attendees. And the first one, I think we might not have the precise answer for this, but might be interesting to know because Dr. Magno has visited Japan several times and actually was a visiting fellow at Hiroshima University before. So if you could comment on the difference between water management practices of Japan and the Philippines.
Maybe I'm not the best person to speak about Japan, even though I visited Japan and I like visiting Japan. But maybe Dahlia, you can better answer that. Except that what I know in Japan is in terms of the preservation of forest cover, Japan has done very well in terms of the forest cover, considering that in a comparative sense, the Philippines and Japan, we both have mountainous terrain. And actually, under Philippine law, well, of course, the State of the Nation address of the president spoke about passing a National Land Use Act. So we don't have a national land use law. But under the physical geographical assessment of the Philippines, 60% of our country should be forested. So if you compare it with Japan, I think Japan is able to do that. 60% mountainous in the Philippines. So we are supposed to have 60% forest cover, but unfortunately, we are below 20% forest cover. I think it's more like 15% forest cover. That's why the Philippines is a high-risk country, considering we have lots of typhoons and we have landslides and we don't have enough forest cover. So I just want to relate that forest and watershed protection and management.
Thank you.
That in fact relates to siltation in the river basin. So that, well, it's probably a long answer.
But no, thank you very much, Dr. Magno, for the one who answered, who asked this question. And for some of you from the attendees, if you're interested in actually comparing this, that could be a point of collaboration later on. Yes, Dr. Bose. Did you raise your hand? I saw you raise your hand. Nope. All right. Okay. But
that was my mistake, but I could add something to that. I think while I don't know enough about the similarities between the two cases, what strikes me about the question is the wording of the use efficiency or efficient water management systems. And I think our focus in studying some of the different case studies has been to see how conflict and post-conflict countries navigate issues in efficiency and inefficiency. And I think the sources of inefficiency are diverse depending on one country to another. You can obviously find some commonalities by virtue of these countries being conflict/post-conflict. So corruption is a factor that ties in the Philippines with some other case studies that we seeing, such as Nepal or water governance in Afghanistan. Elite capture, network practices, and so on and so forth. And there are obviously foreign external stresses, collapsing economy, COVID, so on and so forth, all of which can impact a country's ability to withstand essentially shocks to the system. So what we're talking about efficiency is essentially what the literature of the 90s was referring to as resilience, a resilience of a system to withstand shocks. And that's where we can compare and contrast perhaps post-conflict countries with other systems.
Great, thank you, Srinjoy. We have two questions that I'd probably just summarize and combine because Dr. Magno already mentioned some of the works by civil society groups in Lake Lanao. But do you think some of these activities could be carried over or probably applied to other to the rest of the Philippines if those efforts are actually effective in Lake Lanao? If they're effective, maybe they can be applied elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, actually there are similarities because I've also conducted studies in the northern part, indigenous tenure systems. And yeah, but we have to improve the programming and as Rinjoy mentioned, the tension between state framing and indigenous concepts. There are laws, but you have to reconcile those conflicting laws. And uh, just one point to take up on what Srinjoy mentioned, the post-conflict context. And I think we can apply it not to the country in general, but to the region of Muslim Mindanao. So I like that framing, the post-conflict framing that we can use in assessing Lake Lanao.
Thank you, Dr. Magno. We have one last question. Did also our study, your investigation in Lake Lanao also included or considered the impact of the proposed privatization of the Agus hydropower complex?
Yes, we have that that into consideration, but we haven't fully assessed that part. But we'll definitely have a portion of that in our discussion in the final paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Magno. Thank you, Dr. Bose, for your time today. To our attendees, thank you for your attention. So I look forward personally, and I hope you will also tune in to the outcomes or the publications out of this project. And I hope the key takeaway here is, like, as a Filipino, again, we are often ranked very low in positive peace. But speaking of bouncing back from this climatic shocks, Dr. Magno's presentation was able to show to us that we have these local dynamics that show that, there are local aspects of positive peace that we can perhaps magnify if we look at the national level. So thank you very much for this wonderful, very informative presentation and discussion. And to everybody, you can learn more about our future events, activities, and webinars, especially the upcoming conference next year in Thailand, by visiting our website at www.nerps.org, and for following us also in social media, where we share all these updates. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you in our future events. Thank you very much.